If you were an NBA fan on Twitter, aka X, on September 14th, 2023, you might have seen a bizarre tweet that got an enormous amount of traction. It was a screenshot of NBA Today host Malika Andrews talking to Adrian Wojnarowski about the recent arrest of Rockets guard Kevin Porter Jr. But the screenshot had cropped out Wojnarowski entirely, so that all it showed was Andrews' face above the chyron Rockets guard Kevin Porter Jr. arrested. And the only text other than the screenshot was, "No caption needed." That tweet received over 650 retweets, 1,300 likes, and amassed over 5.2 million views, which was a seismic amount of engagement for a post that, to an outsider, would likely appear completely baffling. For people plugged into the online NBA community, however, a post like that isn't remotely surprising, because since September 2022, a palpable hatred of Andrews has been surging among people who comment on the NBA. Not a dislike, a hatred, one that's become impossible to miss, and that's so pronounced in its intensity that it reeks of sexism to outside observers. Anti-Malika posts are everywhere now, not just on Twitter, but seemingly wherever fans of the NBA congregate online, including Reddit. On YouTube, video essays dissing Andrews are suddenly flourishing, with some of them featuring outlandish to flatly fabricated titles like ESPN has a Malika Andrews problem, Malika Andrews under investigation, exposing the dark truth about Malika Andrews, the dark truth of Malika Andrews, and why Sigma males avoid women like Malika Andrews, some of which have hundreds of thousands of views. As you might imagine, that antipathy towards her is immediately evident in her replies anytime she tweets, which has sometimes been rarely since she's gone through periods where she mostly just retweets other accounts. One of her last non-reply tweets before a long stretch of inactivity came on August 11th when she wrote, "Congratulations to the great Mark Spears and Sports Siren who are heading to the Hoop Hall this weekend." The three most liked comments under her tweet were, "You're not fired yet?" "Hey Malika, you're a scumbag," and "Congrats Malika, looks like you finally fucked your way to the top over at ESPN, Candace Owens 2.0 y'all." Having seen the movement against her bubble up from time to time, and having found it rather bewildering, I decided to look into what was going on here. And as it turns out, the bulk of the complaints against Andrews, who is 28 and black, are presented as being racially based. What many people who follow the NBA literally allege is that Malika Andrews hates black men, that she's actively looking for opportunities to mention the moral failings of black players and black coaches on air, and that the only reason she was given a show to begin with is because ESPN installed her specifically to denigrate black people. Sometimes the racial component of these allegations is downplayed, with people instead insisting that she's too much of a downer or too fixated on people's pasts, but often it's amplified to a degree that's shocking. Some of those YouTube video essays have titles like Malika Andrews, Racism That ESPN Allows, and Proof Malika Andrews Hates Black Men, while others promote the allegation within the videos themselves. One video, titled Malika Andrews, the Puppet of ESPN Basketball, has nearly 1 million views and begins with the text, "The ultimate hater of black human beings, the ultimate hater, there is nothing about her existence that says, I'm black and I'm proud." Another video essay with over 100,000 views includes an edited thumbnail of Malika Andrews saying, "Fuck black men" in a speech bubble while holding up a children's book that reads, "Mommy, I want to be white like you when I grow up." What makes all of this particularly bizarre is how easily refutable the core claim against her is. To the extent that Andrews has ever mentioned someone in and around the NBA getting in trouble, it was because it was important enough of a story that it warranted being mentioned by the host of a daily NBA show, which she happens to be. And to the extent that any of those figures happened to be black, it was incidental to the fact that she covered a sport that happens to be predominantly black. She's also covered the transgressions of people such as Robert Sarver, who is white. For example, when she mentioned in the lead-in show prior to the 2023 NBA draft that Brandon Miller, who was black and who would get selected number 3 overall by the Charlotte Hornets, had been investigated by authorities after his gun had been used by a college teammate to murder a woman, Andrews was referencing something that was one of the biggest storylines of the entire draft and was one of the most famous sports stories in America. To not mention it would have been jarring and irresponsible as a journalist, and all she had done was mention it without any editorial commentary on top of it, and not during the draft itself. Not unlike how every professional draft expert had undoubtedly mentioned this story before, as it was fair to wonder if the investigation into the not insignificant role he played in the murder of an innocent woman in providing the weapon to one of the killers might affect where he would land in the draft. But that brief reference of Miller's investigation by Andrews was cited as proof by Andrews' critics that she had an axe to grind against black men, and that her compulsion to tarnish someone's reputation was so strong that she was liable to do it at any moment, no matter how inopportune. In a Reddit post a couple months later, a user asked the NBA subreddit in a post why there was so much hate towards Andrews, and if there was any evidence to, quote, validate the notion that she hates black men. One of the top comments, with 224 upvotes, wrote, somebody on Twitter said that when Bronny is drafted, this is what she's going to say. 16th pick Bronny James getting ready for his NBA debut with the Atlanta Hawks, and I'd like to mention back in 2020, Bronny was caught recording himself smoking weed underage, which is a crime. However, charges were not pressed. Woj, how do you think that will affect his play? The fact that I can hear her saying this perfectly is crazy. That's why I don't like her that much. Always trying to bring somebody down. This speaks to the self-perpetuating nature of the perception against Andrews, in which virtually anything involving her now, even if it's purely hypothetical or simply imaginary, can serve as proof of her personal agenda. The anti-Malika movement has gotten so specious that anytime she mentions a black player or coach's infraction now, no matter how appropriate it is to mention it, no matter how important the person involved is, and no matter how serious the infraction is, it automatically must have more to do with her quest to put down black men than anything else. That is the context of that viral Kevin Porter Jr. tweet from earlier. It didn't matter that Porter Jr. had allegedly strangled his girlfriend, beaten her face, broken her neck, gotten arrested, and was now unlikely to ever play another second in the league despite being the focal point of an NBA franchise just a season earlier. If Malika Andrews was mentioning it, by definition, it had to be for the worst, most biased reasons possible, according to her critics. You may have noticed that this has the effect of essentially boxing in Andrews and making it impossible for her to ever cover a story of a player or coach's wrongdoing without her getting pilloried for it. There's now no way for Andrews to actually do her job in a way that won't just further upset her critics and feed their derision in perpetuity. And it's hard to look at that rhetorical trapping without detecting the underlying impure intentions at play that are making people this determined to smear her of all people this unreasonably. In the same way that Pizzagate turned innocuous references of pizza into an unhinged conspiracy involving child sex dungeons, there's an alarmingly large corner of the online NBA community that has taken 3 or 4 completely mundane instances of Malika Andrews reading the news off a teleprompter and extrapolated it into a groupthink that paints her as a race traitor. And much like how Pizzagate was steered in that direction by bad faith actors who purposely set out to harm the perception of certain political figures, this growing hostility towards Andrews, this MalikaAnon, if you will, is in my opinion undoubtedly being motivated by people who intentionally want to punish her because she's a woman. The clearest sign of this is the level of vitriol that she receives. There are lots of announcers and sportscasters out there who fans will say, for one reason or another, that they're not that into. But it's only women who ever get this coming after them. An ugly, dedicated push to not merely criticize them, but to crush them and humiliate them and drive them out of the profession. It's only women whose every second in the sports business is tethered with the possibility of constant, never-ending harassment, unless they can prove to the, at times, predominantly male audience that is watching their every movement like a hawk that they're worthy of being on screen. To be a woman in sports is to constantly have to affirm, again and again and again, that you belong. And Malika Andrews, many NBA fans have decided, does not belong. That's why she alone is facing the very specific, maliciously concocted lie of being anti-black, a charge you'll find is being levied against nobody else in the NBA industry, even though you could point to dozens and dozens of other NBA podcasters and writers and even ESPN personalities like Stephen A. Smith, who've brought up the exact same topics that she has, but who are curiously not facing any widespread criticism whatsoever. An illuminating example of this is with the Brandon Miller case. There were two other versions of the 2023 NBA draft that aired on the ESPN family of networks that night, other than the one Andrews was hosting. And in both of those other versions, Miller's investigation was not just referenced during the draft itself, but vividly described. On ABC, Kevin Negandhi not only mentioned it, but mentioned it alongside an on-screen graphic that went into far greater detail about it than Andrews did. And on YouTube, the special hosted by the Hoop Collective podcast featured the panel discussing Miller's investigation at the exact moment he was drafted. Malika Andrews was actually the only ESPN anchor that night who didn't mention Miller's connection with the murder during the draft itself. And yet she alone was the one who NBA fans came away furious at for allegedly trying to sabotage Miller's night with constant negativity. Why? Because she was the only one who NBA fans came into wanting to be upset at. For an even greater example of this, look no further than what happened with her and Josh Giddey. On the week of Thanksgiving in 2023, an allegation surfaced on Twitter from an anonymous user that Oklahoma City Thunder guard Josh Giddey had been involved in a sexual relationship with a minor who was still in high school and allegedly as young as 15 years old. On Friday, November 24th, the NBA announced that they were investigating the allegations, and almost as soon as the allegations spread, users on NBA Twitter began joking, wink wink, that Malika Andrews wasn't going to mention the allegations against Giddey on air because Giddey was white, and therefore she was going to protect him in a way that she wouldn't if he had been black. As the days passed, and as Andrews was not speaking about the allegations on television, that joke stopped being a joke, with fans transitioning to slamming Andrews in the harshest terms imaginable for not covering the story. More days passed, and the bile grew and grew, with thousands of users piling on her to the point that her name began trending on social media from it. One aggregated post about the controversy on Twitter pulled in over 21 million views, while former NFL receiver Bryant, who sounded very much like he had been radicalized by at least one of those aforementioned YouTube essays, became the highest profile person to go after her, not only calling her, quote, a puppet in a tweet, but claiming, insanely, that this was proof that her parents had raised her wrong. On Monday, November 27th, Malika Andrews finally covered the Josh Giddey allegations on NBA Today. But by that point, in her critics' eyes, it didn't even matter. To them, the gap between when the allegations first surfaced to when she discussed them had been so unacceptably long that it served as validation that they had been right about her all along, and that she really did treat black people worse than she treated white people. There was just one logistical problem with their argument, however. And that was that the reason it had taken Andrews 3 days after the NBA announced it was investigating Giddey to discuss it on air was because that news had dropped on Thanksgiving weekend and her show wasn't on the air at the time, which was kind of important. On the day the NBA announced that it was investigating Giddey, NBA Today was not on TV because it was Black Friday. Instead, what was airing in that time slot was the pregame show for the championship of the Bad Boy Mowers Battle for Atlantis college basketball tournament. And while there were NBA games that aired on ESPN that night, Andrews was not the studio host for them, possibly because it was Black Friday and she might have had the night off. Hence why her duties fell to Chiney Ogwumike instead. By Monday, it was true that some American sports programs or sports media members had yet to address Giddey's allegations. But Andrews was not one of them. She covered them at the first chance she had on her show. In fact, by the time Des Bryant had tweeted that she hadn't covered the story yet, she had already covered it earlier in the day. Not only should Andrews not have been criticized for not covering the story, she had objectively covered it more diligently and more swiftly than virtually everyone else in all of sports media with a major platform. But again, that didn't matter to the people who were against her. Andrews, like the subjects of so many other conspiracy theories before her, had become so dehumanized and such a caricature to her critics that the reality that a complaint that made her look bad wasn't real was secondary to the fact that they wanted it to be real and thought it might as well be real. Tens of thousands of users manifested out of thin air an entire discourse about how horrible she was based purely on them imagining that she was horrible. So horrible that not even Josh Giddey, an alleged pedophile, an alleged rapist, could be anything more than a cudgel to them to be used against the true object of their scorn, Malika Andrews. The imperative question that needs to be asked, though, is why is this happening to her? Why is Malika Andrews, and Malika Andrews alone, being targeted like this by NBA fans? Where is this coming from? From the moment I began researching this subject, a rather straightforward explanation came to mind, and that is that on September 23rd, 2022, something notable happened with Malika Andrews on TV. I didn't have to divine that as a possible starting point either, because it was something that Andrews' online detractors pointed to more than anything else for why they said they didn't like her. But I didn't want to accept this at first, because it felt too easy an explanation. It felt too simple, too clean. I thought, surely there had to be more to this. So I started to look backwards, searching to see if maybe there was something else that could have ignited all of this. And yet, amazingly, I only came away with further support that my initial hypothesis was right. What's remarkable is that in the time from when she first started being a mainstay on ESPN up to September 2022, Malika Andrews wasn't just liked by NBA fans, she was adored. NBA fans overwhelmingly embraced her. I searched Twitter posts from 2021 to September 2022 for any signs of mass anger or resentment towards Andrews, but there was nothing, not an iota of it. I searched the NBA subreddit from that same time period to see if there was anything brewing against her or if any criticisms about her were gaining traction, but there was nothing. I searched YouTube to see if there were any bizarre, defamatory video essays that had been made about her during that span. And once again, the answer was no. The anti-Malika movement, quite simply, did not exist prior to September 2022. So, what happened in September 2022? What was the event that not only turned thousands of NBA fans against her, seemingly overnight, but kickstarted a conspiracy against her that increasingly feels like it's going to swallow the online NBA community whole? As it turns out, The answer is rather straightforward. Malika Andrews went on First Take. In order to understand the backlash to Malika Andrews, it first needs to be said that First Take, ESPN's flagship morning debate show, is not only the most sexist show on the channel, but one of the most sexist shows on all of television, and that its continued existence on ESPN is nothing short of an embarrassment. That distinction lays primarily on the shoulders of Stephen A. Smith, who's the star of the show, and someone who's made a litany of sexist comments over the years. When Ray Rice was suspended for striking his then-fiancée in an elevator and knocking her unconscious, Smith went on the air and stated that women needed to do their part to avoid getting beaten, saying, "Let's make sure we don't do anything to provoke wrong actions." When Chad Johnson was accused of hitting his wife, Smith said something similar, asserting, "There are plenty of instances where provocation comes into consideration, and I am sick and tired of men constantly being vilified and accused of things." When discussing Floyd Mayweather's long-documented history of assaulting women, Smith said he didn't care because he enjoyed him as a boxer. And when then-host Carrie Champion told him that she had a problem with Mayweather's conduct, Smith loudly replied that she only held that position, quote, "because she's a woman, and this is how she feels he conducts himself. I am a boxing fan." When Maren Mjelde of Norway completed an impressive goal over the heads of German defenders one time, Smith joked that the German women might not have blocked it because they, quote, "might not have wanted to mess their hair." When Larry Wilmore asked him if he liked that women were taking on a greater role in men's sports, Smith initially said yes, but then pivoted, unprompted, to saying how much he disliked that women were competing in mixed martial arts, saying, "Where I jump off the bandwagon is where they try to engage physically. And I wouldn't promote legislating laws to prohibit them from doing so, but I don't want to see women punching each other in the face. I don't want to see women fighting in the octagon and stuff like that." When UFC President Dana White was caught on video hitting his wife, Smith came to his defense, not only saying, quote, "he knows that he crossed a line that he never crossed before, and that he swears he'll never cross again. He is incredibly ashamed of himself. That's where we are right now," but admitting that he had called White beforehand to let him know that he'd be mentioning him on air, adding, "He's a friend. I love him." And when Steph Curry's wife, Ayesha, tweeted that an NBA game Steph had played in had been, quote, "rigged," Smith responded by saying that LeBron James's wife, Savannah, was superior to her because she was less vocal, saying, "she's wonderful inside and out. She sits there, she doesn't bring any attention to herself. She never tweets and goes out there and calls out the league and stuff like that." But it's more than just Smith's propensity to say things like that makes First Take what it is. It's the show itself, which has been tilted away from women going all the way back to 2011, when it was first conceived as a full-time debate show by Jamie Horowitz, a male producer who would later be expelled from the television sports industry for sexually harassing women. The conceit of First Take involves two people debating each other, usually in the most loud, obnoxious manner possible, while a host sits back and basically stays silent until the two debaters are done yelling at each other. It is, by design, a very trashy show, the emptiest of empty calories. But it's not just any trash, it's trash for men. It's lowest common denominator slop, meant to suck in that guy at the bar who only consumes sports through the most primitive, pre-chewed lens imaginable. That guy who takes sports a little too seriously and who views women's presence in it as nothing short of an interference. First Take is ESPN's answer to Saturdays Are for the Boys, and far from push back against the problematic expectations of its overwhelmingly male audience, the show has done everything possible to reinforce them. There is no sports show on television that otherizes women quite so thoroughly. Outside of host Molly Karam, women rarely appear on First Take, and almost never on a consistent basis. During a 2020 appearance by Megan Thee Stallion, Kiram even noted, "I'm excited, I don't get a lot of women on the show." A statement that caused Stephen A. to glare at the camera in incredulity, as though the suggestion was beneath them. To the extent that women are on First Take, it's always as an outsider and always at a standing below Stephen A.'s. For all the turnover that's taken place on the show, the one and only constant is that Stephen A. virtually never debates women, and never for very long. The show has welcomed all sorts of odious people to go mano a mano with him, including Michael Irvin, who has multiple rape allegations against him, and recently Shannon Sharpe, who has also been accused of rape. LeVar Ball got a ton of run on the show for a bit, before finally getting banned for making an explicitly misogynistic comment towards Kiram on air. Men with icky track records have passed through the First Take studios in droves. The aforementioned Dana White, Floyd Mayweather, and Chad Johnson are all on good terms with Stephen A., and have all retained their friend of the show status despite their history with domestic abuse. But women have never been allowed to be the solitary, full show primary debater against Smith. If a second woman is ever on screen on First Take, it's guaranteed to be brief and never, ever with them being on the same level as the male star. Then there's the hosting role, which is so restrictive and ceremonial that it requires the lone woman on set to more or less stay completely silent the vast majority of the time outside of posing topics to the debaters. Carrie Champion, the previous host of First Take, gave an interview with I Am Athlete in 2022 in which she expressed dismay at how little autonomy she was allowed to have on the show. Quote, "The problem was, for me as a black woman in that position, and at the time, you can do the research, no one was Monday through Friday on a popular 2-hour TV show that was a black woman, and they let me know I didn't matter. Intentionally, unintentionally, it was obvious. You don't matter, just be happy that you're here. Ask questions, don't talk, be happy that you're here." Kiram's role is essentially the same. There are long stretches where her duty is to sit there and say nothing, with the added symbolism of being at an oblong table that physically pushes her chair away from the other cast members, so that she's always sitting farther away from the camera and thus is less on screen than Stephen A. and whoever he's debating. Adding to that is that during the debates, the show will often cut to a split screen between Smith and the other debater that doesn't include Kiram at all, meaning that it's not uncommon to see prolonged 10-minute segments in which Kiram is both unheard from and invisible on the show. Supporters of First Take would note that Kiram does speak up on important issues from time to time, particularly ones that demand the perspective of a woman. But it also never feels like those aren't the only occasions where her presence is actually demanded. To the extent that she ever chimes in on a discussion, it's as an interloper. On virtually every other show on television, the host is the central figure, and you get the sense that they're the ones steering and crafting the conversation, even if they're not the one doing the most talking. But on First Take, the power dynamic is inverted. Kiram can speak, but only to the degree that her male counterpart, who recently got their other male counterpart fired, is cool with it. Kiram herself has attributed her longevity on the show to accepting that Smith will always matter more than her on it. Quote, "I think one reason it works is because Stephen A. is the star of the show. I've never really cared about that," she told the Rise and Shine podcast in 2023. "In terms of him being the star, I'm not trying to be the star. I want to be part of the team." What all of this has done is form an especially toxic, sexist community around the show, who tunes in not only having assimilated Smith's views on women, but with the full expectation that they'll have to hear from women as briefly and infrequently as possible. In the scant instances where the show has ever brushed up against that paradigm, the reaction has been abrasive. A 2016 International Business Times interview with Kiram noted that she received blowback from viewers when she cut off then-mainstay Max Kellerman, who she felt was beginning to inadvertently rationalize why Brock Turner had raped a woman. That same year, when all the regulars were on vacation, an all-female panel took their place for one episode and were met with, according to the Wrap, an onslaught of sexist remarks on social media. Katie Nolan, who would later join ESPN, even tweeted at the time, 1. Search First Take on Twitter. 2. Click live to see all results. 3. See how mad men are 8 minutes into an all-female panel. 4. Sigh. To be clear, this isn't remotely close to being only a First Take problem. Sports talk has long been a hostile work environment for women, and it's taken an exceedingly long time for that to change, including at ESPN. But at no point has First Take done anything but coddle and reinforce the biases and prejudices of its male audience. In a rapidly changing world, its fandom is a special kind of awful, a superficial, reactive audience that's been trained to see the world in the cartoonishly simple wrestling binary that Smith lays out on every possible issue, sometimes with as little preparation or research as possible, like when he said that Shohei Ohtani was, quote, harming baseball because he spoke Japanese. To come away from First Take is to come away with the perspective that everything in sports lives on the extreme. Something is always the best ever or the worst ever. Someone is always the best ever or the worst ever. And by extension, someone is either to be loved or hated. You're either the GOAT or you're the worst. You're either really, really good or you need to be fired. It is a landscape, in other words, where nuance and progressive thinking and measured arguments go to die. It is not a place where old-timey, preconceived views get challenged. And it is certainly, categorically, not a place where it is at all acceptable to go at Stephen A. Smith for spreading those views. That is the buzzsaw that Malika Andrews walked into on Friday, September 23rd, 2022. The setup to one of the most impactful unscripted crossovers in recent television memory goes like this. 1.5 days earlier, Adrian Wojnarowski had reported that Ime Udoka, the head coach of the Boston Celtics team that had just gone to the NBA Finals, was possibly facing a significant suspension for violating their organizational guidelines. Within a day, both he and Shams Charania would report that Udoka was being suspended for the entire upcoming season for having an inappropriate consensual relationship with a female staff member. The news was shocking, and the details about it were scarce. On First Take, Smith's reaction had been to say that the Celtics were hanging Udoka out to dry.
Because I got news for you, America. There's plenty of white folks in professional sports that's doing their thing. And I say that not complimentary. I don't see the information out about them. Why are we talking about this now? We got to talk about it because it's the news. Ain't none of our damn business unless you fire him. But if you keep him, it's none of our business. Mm-hmm. It should have never been put out there by the Celtics organization. And don't tell me you didn't do it, because you absolutely did it, because news reporters got it. So it emanated out of Boston. Somebody ain't in L.A. or Utah or something leaking this stuff about the Boston Celtics. Right. This is on y'all.
Smith's comments, which blew up on Twitter, would be noteworthy in what was to come, because while he didn't precisely defend Udoka or even dismiss the justification of him being fired, he suggested that there may have been a racial component as to why Udoka was being punished and why the news about his affair had come out. Many sports fans, at the time the story broke, were similarly bewildered at the Celtics taking such punitive action over a consensual relationship, even if it was a relationship that had undoubtedly violated standard workplace practices. In the brief aftermath of Woj's report, a consensus opinion had formed among many online NBA fans that the Celtics were overreacting. By the end of Thursday, however, Woj and Shams' initial reports, which had already been light on specifics, felt woefully insufficient to flat out inaccurate on an important detail. At 12:42 a.m. that evening, Shams Charania tweeted a link to a report stating that while the Celtics organization had initially believed Udoka's relationship with a female staffer had been consensual, quote, "The woman recently accused Udoka of making unwanted comments towards her, leading the team to launch a set of internal interviews." This was a crucial new piece of information that dynamited the consensuality of Udoka's relationship as an established fact. The next morning, a lot of extra eyeballs tuned into First Take to see what Smith was going to say about the Udoka situation. The clip of him blasting the Celtics from the day before had gone viral, but Sham's report certainly seemed to complicate it now, if not invalidate it. Smith's commentary that morning was all over the place. He sounded defensive, stuck. He'd already placed his eggs in the basket that Udoka was being wronged, but now that take didn't seem as surefire as it had the day before. His strategy that morning seems like it might have been to barrel through his previous take again, while sporadically sprinkling in a contradictory one in order to give himself some plausible deniability. Because while he continued describing Udoka's relationship as consensual, and continued saying that the Celtics' treatment of him was wrong, he also added, incongruously, that Udoka's actions were, quote, "inexcusable and a fireable offense as far as I'm concerned." Somehow, Udoka both deserved to be punished, and it was deeply suspiciously wrong of the Celtics to have punished him at all. It was as though Smith hadn't actually mapped out all the parameters of his take and was trying to figure them out in real time. And then, in the course of talking out every possible angle of the story, Smith wandered into deeply problematic territory.
It said in the numerous news reports, it was a consensual relationship that violated organizational policy. So only he is in violation of the company policy. The woman who elected to have a consensual relationship with him is not in violation. He gets to get mentioned and put on Front Street. We don't know who she is. What about the other women within the Celtics organization who have been victimized because wrong assumptions have been made by their involvement? If you knew exactly who it was, that would alleviate the concerns of all the other women who have had their names paraded out into the streets. What about them?
Here's where you have to imagine a socially progressive NBA fan who was tuning in out of curiosity, reacting with horror to Smith. First Take is many things, but it is not unpopular. Few shows on television get routinely aggregated as much as First Take clips, which are sometimes unavoidable on sports Twitter. And here was Smith, the biggest personality on the network, using his platform to not only suggest that the woman Udoka harassed wasn't being properly punished, but that she needed to be publicly dragged out into the open so as not to be mistaken with the other women in the Celtics organization. This was a deeply irresponsible, repulsive position by Smith that was tantamount to blaming the woman in question for Udoka's suspension and calling for her to get punished for it. It harkened back to the crux of what Smith had insinuated about both Chad Johnson and Ray Rice years earlier, that women needed to be held responsible when men got in trouble for doing bad things to them. It was right after Smith said this that Malika Andrews called into the show, sounding genuinely upset. First Take doesn't normally take calls either, so it seemed immediately apparent that Andrews had not only been watching First Take that morning, but had reached a breaking point with what Smith had been saying and felt that she needed to do something about it. Here's what she said when she came on the show.
If I could first start with this. Stephen A., with all due respect, this is not about pointing the finger. Stop. What became apparent to me in this press conference is that we do not have all of the information here. And it was frustrating to me that the Celtics declined to elaborate or to give more specifics about what exactly the rule breaking was that led us to this point. But the fact that it was able to go on all day, the fact that we are sitting here debating whether somebody else should have been suspended or not, we are not here, Stephen A., to further blame women. That is not why we are here.
It's worth taking a second to appreciate how momentous this was. for all the bluster and bravado that oozes out of First Take, the reality is that the show has been crafted to insulate Smith from ever having debates with people that actually wound him or make him look bad. Everything about it, from the host to the debaters to the format, has been molded so that the debates are always facile and his worldview never gets substantively challenged. It's why when he's not on First Take, Stephen A. Smith makes regular appearances on Fox News shows, where there's no threat of his misogynistic worldview ever getting called into question. And so, after years and years of spewing sexist takes and getting away with it, and depriving women of even having the opportunity to refute him, here was someone in Andrews who, for the first and only time ever in the show's history, was actually calling him out on his reductive bullshit in real time, live on the air. Smith's response went like this.
First of all, let me be very clear. I don't appreciate where you're going with that. I'm not blaming anybody but Ime Udoka. He deserves, the fact of the matter is, I've said he deserved to be fired if they were going to fire him. If you're not going to fire him, then don't fire him. My issue is all of this being publicized. The point that I'm trying to make is just like you're not mentioning. Excuse me. I listened to you. You're the one telling me to stop on my show. It ain't happening. Okay, that's number one.
Smith then finished a sanitized version of his take that notably eliminated any suggestion that the woman in question needed to be held accountable, despite his insistence that that was the case just minutes before Andrews had called in. Not long after that, Andrews parted from the show. The interaction between her and Smith had been incredibly brief, all things considered, but it had been raw and emotional in a way that stood out to people. This wasn't the normal posturing and genuflecting that First Take was known for. This had been a real, uncomfortable argument, and it blew up on social media. The reaction to Andrews on Twitter was not merely intense, but vitriolic, and in order to understand why, it should be noted that while Shams' report casts an important light on the Udoka story, his report had come out so late and was itself so light on specifics that it was still being overshadowed by his and Woj's initial statements that Udoka was only in trouble for having a consensual relationship. What that meant is that the crucial detail that Udoka started making unwanted comments to the woman in question was never fully assimilated by the online NBA community, who instead maintained the belief that Udoka had only been punished for having an affair. To this day, a huge amount of online NBA fans still believe that Udoka had been treated unfairly in Boston. In other words, when that clip of Smith telling Andrews to be quiet reached NBA fans, it was reaching an audience that was widely and demonstrably siding with Udoka. And as such, they didn't just side with Smith a little bit in his on-air squabble with Andrews, they sided with him almost uniformly. If you search the replies and quote tweets of the tweets that aggregated this moment, you'll find that hardly anybody was agreeing with Andrews, while user after user after user praised Smith and exoriated Andrews. What's amazing is that Andrews hadn't even criticized Udoka in her appearance on First Take. Her objection had been towards Smith floating that the woman in question needed to be reprimanded, which was an entirely reasonable thing for her to have a problem with. But that context was largely lost on NBA fans, who mostly processed her words as her being emotional and outraged at Udoka himself, which thus placed her squarely in the crosshairs of their ire. Who is conceptually responsible for morphing that ire into a conspiracy theory about her is a matter of conjecture, and it wouldn't be fair to blame its origin wholly on First Take or its fans, especially now that it's a fully autonomous beast that is carried almost entirely by the NBA community. Many of the people who bashed Andrews didn't appear to be regular First Take viewers at all, and even went out of their way to say that they normally didn't agree with Stephen A. Smith. That said, there is an undeniable overlap between the NBA community and First Take, not the least of which because the NBA community, it should be self-evident, is also rather sexist. Smith is the leading NBA commentator on ESPN. He's the #1 analyst on their halftime show, the first person they go to discuss the NBA on SportsCenter, and the primary NBA voice who appears on their website and app. Smith has become synonymous with the NBA, and as such, he and his show have had a tremendous impact on how people view the sport. Since the inception of First Take, the league's fandom has become consumed with the never-ending bar fights about who's good or who's the best or who's overrated in a way that mimics the show's template, to the degree that it can sometimes feel that to follow the NBA is to consume one long, never-ending First Take segment. The First Takeification of the league is so pronounced that the NBA Players Union even hosts an annual media boot camp now, in which personalities like Rob Parker, who was once a regular debater on First Take, give media training to players that instructs them on how to best produce hot takes that will get them engagement. Regardless of who exactly is to blame, when that First Take segment injected itself into the online NBA fandom, it created a negative reaction to Malika Andrews so potent that it never went away. NBA fans, who to that point had been cool with Andrews, now looked at her as a double agent, as someone who was actively advocating against the thing they liked, and by extension them, from within the system. When later that day, Andrews, in a segment on NBA Today, carefully but pointedly told Kendrick Perkins that he needed to not speculate about what had happened in Boston, a clip in which NBA fans again found issue with her, a justification for why they were so angry with her began to crystallize for them. The perception that Udoka was being racially targeted, an idea that Smith himself had popularly pushed and that NBA fans largely subscribed to, collided with the conspiratorial inclinations of online NBA fans and the fact that Andrews had now publicly disagreed with Smith, Perkins, and ostensibly Udoka, all of whom are black. When those factors fused with the irrational, misplaced anger that fans had at her, an encompassing explanation formulated to explain why Andrews was not to be liked. She hated black men. Up to September 23rd, 2022, there was effectively nobody in the history of NBA Twitter who had ever pushed that sentiment. Within a week, so many hundreds of users were alleging it that it was impossible to sift through them all. Once that narrative entered the bloodstream, it became a self-perpetuating vehicle for NBA fans to openly pile on Andrews. From then on, anytime she mentioned the indiscretions of a player or coach who happened to be black, it served as validation for fans to openly express negativity towards her. And because the proof, quote-unquote, they were seeking was so specious and basic, Andrews, just by virtue of doing her job, invariably kept feeding their confirmation bias, causing the movement against her to not only grow, but continually reaffirm itself. Eventually, users began to actively seek out reasons to dislike her. And to meet that demand, YouTube essays started popping up like crazy to explicitly make the case that Andrews hates black men. Those videos, to be clear, are uniformly terrible and reek of the laziness usually found in channels that are trying to pump out as much content as humanly possible. Quality be damned. Virtually all of them take a moment to deride feminism and to cite it as the culprit of Andrews' statements. But some venture into even darker and creepier territory, analyzing her upbringing and genealogy in an attempt to link them to the way she sees the world. One particularly deranged video, with over 125,000 views, features a narrator saying this at one point.
So Malika Andrews is from a mixed-race marriage. Her father is a so-called black man, and her mother is from the Uish community. And I purposely mispronounced that because There's just certain words, for whatever reason, that I cannot get away with saying on this platform. I think certain channels are just held to a higher standard than others. But in any event, you all know what I mean.
Videos like that speak to the disturbing, permissive nature of the movement against Andrews, in which just about any critique of her can be largely accepted. And sure enough, the replies to that video were almost universally positive. The foundation of the criticism of her was flimsy enough to begin with fans erupting at her for saying something that she hadn't really said. But as time has gone on, and as more and more NBA fans have joined the chorus of critics, have joined the pylon, the grounds for publicly disliking her has collapsed to the point that just about anything flies. In most online NBA circles, you can now trash Malika Andrews and not only receive minimal to no blowback for it, but get praise and engagement for it, which only furthers the vicious cycle. Hating her has become so mainstream and so commonplace among NBA fans that when it was reported in August 2023 that she would be the new host of ESPN's NBA halftime show, almost all of the thousands of quote tweets and replies to the announcement on Twitter were negative. Maybe the bleakest example of how much NBA fans have turned on her came in October, when it was reported that Andrews had been granted a restraining order against a 41-year-old man who had been stalking and harassing her. That man, who it turns out was an obsessive First Take watcher, had become obsessed with Andrews after her on-air confrontation with Smith in September 2022. According to ESPN, who filed the order on her behalf, the stalker had been leaving derogatory and threatening messages to Andrews on both her Twitter account and phone number, and had mentioned that he was trying to track her down. ESPN asserted that his behavior had taken such a mental toll on Andrews that she no longer felt safe coming into work, and, quote, does not feel comfortable interacting with her fans on social media. The stalker's mindset, as you might have guessed, appeared to be in lockstep with the conspiratorial movement against her, even tweeting at one point that she needed to, quote, stop bringing up negative old news. Andrews herself noted in the restraining order that the stalker, quote, seemed to have some sort of delusion that he knows me or has a relationship with me. When NBA Central, a popular Twitter news aggregator, posted a tweet about that story that got more than 5 million views, nearly every initial reply and quote tweet was unsympathetic of Andrews, even though the tweet had mentioned that Andrews, quote, fears for her safety. Commenter after commenter either focused on the fact that the tweet mentioned that she was engaged to ESPN colleague Dave McMenamin, or took the opportunity to mock her and even blame her for bringing the incident upon herself, while the rare, isolated tweets showing support for her received almost no likes whatsoever. In barely a year, Malika Andrews had become such a pariah and so widely loathed within the online NBA community that not even posts about her being in possible physical danger could garner her support anymore. As one of the only non-inappropriate comments in the entire reply section put it, God, these quotes and replies are so awful. There's no way to say how much longer this will go on for and how much worse it might get. It's possible the internet will eventually grow tired with Andrews and fixate on someone else instead. It's also possible that this isn't going to get better, and Andrews will spend the rest of her career feeling like the very fan base she's trying to appeal to is actively against her. What should be said, unequivocally, is that none of this is fair or deserved. If you watch NBA today, you'll see that Andrews is not an overly negative person, or an angry person, or is even close to using her platform to hold back black men. Hell, you'll find that her show has even had Stephen A. Smith appear on it several times since September 2022. Instead, what you'll see are all the qualities that, until recently, NBA fans overwhelmingly liked about her, which are that she's energetic and charming and positive and exudes her coverage with an undeniable love of basketball. She, like so many women before her, who've been painted as one-dimensional monsters for the sake of engendering hostility towards them, is so far removed from being the person that her critics say she is that it's almost unbelievable. The people in the anti-Malika movement are growling at a villain who simply does not exist in reality. The fact that Andrews has to deal with this anyway says a lot about how latently rancid the online NBA community is, as well as sports fandom in general. It's not debatable what's happening here. The fact that every instance, without exception, in which fans have gotten mad at Andrews involved her discussing an incident that included an assault or sexual misconduct against a woman is hardly a coincidence. Every stage of this campaign against her has been drenched in misogyny. It is the culmination of a sexist man on a sexist show saying something sexist about a woman who had something sexually inappropriate happen to her, that same man getting challenged on it by a woman, telling that woman to stop talking in a condescending way that sounded sexist, that shows sexist fans getting mad at that woman, NBA fans siding with the man in the equation, deciding that the woman was against them and therefore had a deep-seated and nefarious ulterior motive, turning on that woman forever, and then trying as fervently as possible to make other people turn on her too. It took almost no provocation whatsoever, a simple several-minute-long phone call, for Andrews standing in the online NBA community to immediately deteriorate. And it speaks to how conditional men's support of women in the sports media world really is. NBA fans only liked Andrews in the same way First Take fans liked Carrie Champion and Molly Karam, which is right up to the point that they ever start to challenge their perception that sports is intrinsically a guy thing, that exists to be isolated from the influence of women. It's why all it takes is the mere presence of a woman in sports media where there normally isn't one for people to lose their minds about it. It's why the most popular NBA writer in America is Bill Simmons, a man who spent years arguing that women shouldn't be allowed in fantasy leagues with men, that WNBA scores shouldn't be included on sports news tickers, and that he, quote, can't listen to Doris Burke analyze NBA playoff games without thinking, woman talking, woman talking, woman talking, woman talking, the entire time. That there would be a contingent of online jerks who'd transpose a sexist conspiracy onto Andrews, one of the only young black female hosts on all of television, let alone in sports, is in retrospect not that surprising. But the staggering degree to which NBA fans have co-opted it, the scale in which they've decided to follow the hateful, miserable losers pushing this garbage off a cliff based on nothing but innocuous junk is not just shameful, but pathetic. Even the gateway, seemingly less intolerant criticism of Andrews, that she's too negative or won't let go of the past, is nothing more than thinly veiled chauvinism, rooted in the vintage trope that women are nags who need to shut up and stand aside and let the men enjoy their sporting event without them having to think about real-world issues, and least of all issues about women. It's one of the reasons why Stephen A's initial rant against the Celtics had resonated as well as it had, because he hadn't merely been mad at the Celtics for what they'd done with Udoka. No, he had been mad at the Celtics specifically because he had to talk about Udoka's indiscretions with a woman at all. To NBA fans, Smith was standing for seeing basketball in an apolitical vacuum, removed from cultural distractions, to the degree that he was even saying that the outside variable, the woman in question, needed to be reprimanded for causing the affair to be in the news. And Andrews, to NBA fans, she was representing the opposite extreme. And so they extrapolated the simple act of her momentarily challenging Smith as her subliminally caping for all the things they don't want to see in sports. First Take and Stephen A. Smith may have been the catalyst for the movement against her, but it only took off because NBA fans were ready and waiting to punish anybody of her prominence for introducing even the slightest shred of femininity into their masculine safe space. And if there's anything I can emphasize that you should take from this video, it's that the people pushing this movement against her are the biggest fucking incel losers in the world. And that if you tag along and add to this pylon, you're even sadder than they are. Because you're not even hating her because you're a sexist loser who actually hates her. You're hating her because you're a sexist loser who can't even think for themselves. As it stands, Andrews is poised to be more ubiquitous on TV than ever, now that she's the host of ESPN's pregame and halftime NBA studio show. Normally, such a promotion would be unambiguously wonderful, but for Andrews, it comes with the peril of not only being more exposed to an online audience that doesn't like her, but more exposed to none other than Stephen A. Smith, who has become a fixture on the panel, even though exceedingly few people seem to actually like any of the panels he's on. This means that for the foreseeable future, Andrews' career will be tied to the hip with the very person whose ignorant commentary butterfly affected the vast majority of NBA Twitter into despising her and a crazed stalker into making her afraid to come into work. And she'll interact with Smith knowing full well that the slightest hiccup in their connection, the slightest frown or sarcastic remark or obnoxious smirk from Smith is all it might take to unleash yet another onslaught of sexist resentment towards her. What's more, she'll know all this while having to accept that Smith doesn't have to worry about any of that. Andrews has faced substantially more of a reckoning for doing truly nothing than Smith has for all the sexist takes he's ever given for a decade and a half combined. NBA fans are infinitely more upset at Andrews for telling Smith to check his privilege than they ever were when he suggested that a domestically abused woman had brought it upon herself. And that's not an immunity Smith built upon being a star. That's an immunity built on the fact that there's something that inoculates him from ever having to deal with the widespread conspiratorial harassment campaign that Andrews is dealing with right now. And that's that he is a man.